April 17, 2013. An enormous explosion rocked the city of West Texas when 30 tons of fertilizer-grade ammonium nitrate detonated at the West Fertilizer Company. The blast killed 15 people and injured hundreds more. Nearby homes and businesses were severely damaged, many beyond repair. The Chemical Safety Board launched an investigation and found poor hazard awareness, the proximity of the facility to nearby homes and businesses, inadequate emergency planning, and limited regulatory oversight all led to the severity of the accident.
This was one of the most destructive explosions ever investigated by the CSB. Our safety recommendations address steps that should be taken at all levels to help prevent a similar tragedy in the future.
The West Fertilizer Company was a fertilizer retail and distribution facility in West Texas, 80 miles south of Dallas. There, ammonium nitrate and other chemicals used as fertilizers were stored in a 12,000 square foot building that was constructed of combustible material, mostly wood. Outside, the West Volunteer Fire Department sought to extinguish the flames with water. 1.5-inch hoses directed water through sliding doors to the seed room. Other firefighters were in the process of connecting a 4-inch hose to a fire hydrant that was more than a quarter mile away. As the fire grew, the fire chief and assistant fire chief began to discuss whether to withdraw, but it was too late. At 7:51 p.m., 20 minutes after the fire was first reported, approximately 30 tons of the stored ammonium nitrate detonated, causing a massive explosion.
Maybe actually, probably, yeah.
12 emergency responders and 3 members of the public died as a result of the explosion. Over 260 people were injured. West Fertilizer was completely destroyed. More than 150 nearby homes and businesses were damaged, some beyond repair. There was hundreds of millions of dollars of loss in the city of West. The CSB also learned that the West Volunteer Fire Department was not required to perform pre-incident planning for an ammonium nitrate-related emergency. This planning would have enabled them to determine the hazards of all of the materials on site and may have helped them develop a strategy for responding to an ammonium nitrate fire, including allowing the fertilizer building to burn to the ground if doing so would protect lives.
Without knowledge of the explosion hazards posed by ammonium nitrate and a plan for how to respond to a fire involving the chemical, the emergency responders at West simply did not have enough time to critically assess the situation before the explosion occurred.
Hello, this is Chief Chuck Hampton with Dallas Fire Rescue. Today we'll be discussing what pre-incident planning is and why it's important. As we saw in the previous clip taken from the U.S. Chemical Safety Board's report on the West explosion, our business is a deadly serious one. But we have tools at our disposal that can make it less dangerous, and one of those tools is pre-incident planning. So what is pre-incident planning? Simply put, it is planning for an emergency incident at a particular location before the incident happens. By imagining scenarios in advance and anticipating the unique challenges a structure may pose for us, we can decrease the risk of a firefighter being injured or killed and increase the likelihood that we will handle the emergency quickly and effectively. At a fire scene, if we know exactly where to find the Knox box, how the building is laid out, where the closest standpipe connection is, and where the pumper needs to hook into the FDC, odds are things are going to go well for us. And if we don't know these things, odds are we're going to have a tough row to hoe. It is also important to understand that pre-incident planning is not just for fires. Pre-incident planning is essential for locations that store hazardous materials. Do you know what locations in your district store hazmat? What kinds of chemicals do they have on site? Are the quantities small enough that they pose little danger, or large enough that a release could threaten the entire area? If there is a spill, are there actions we could take to contain it? If there is a fire, are the chemicals water reactive? If there is a toxic plume, what downwind buildings may need to be evacuated? For what distance should we evacuate? If there is a high-rise building across the street, should the occupants evacuate or shelter in place? Having made that decision, how will we communicate the decision to the occupants of the building? Does that building have an intercom system? Does it actually work? Do we know how to use it? If we are sheltering in place, could the building engineer close the fresh air intake on the HVAC system? Don't assume that hazmat will be there to tell you what to do. You're going to be the first officer on site, and it is quite possible that the hazmat team won't be coming anytime soon. We don't have a team solely dedicated to hazardous materials response, so even if our team is not already on a hazmat call, they could well be at a fire scene with all their gut on the ground, which will leave you making the critical decisions. Serious hazardous materials incidents like we've been talking about are rare, but pre-incident planning helps with everyday calls as well. As an example, consider a typical cut-off-the-water call. These are simple enough at residences and light commercial, but are sometimes challenging at larger facilities. The good news is that by doing a site survey of buildings in our district during working hours and documenting the location of sprinkler control valves, domestic water shutoffs, etc., we can rest assured that we won't ever have to spend a lot of time wandering around the facility looking for a cutoff at 2 a.m. on a cold winter night. One thing that's changed over time is the complexity of the buildings we're responding to. Take apartments, for example. We didn't need a pre-incident plan for apartments when they looked like this in the 1960s, or even much of one when they looked like this in the 1980s. But modern apartment complexes, which are currently being built all over town, are a different animal altogether. Instead of separate apartment buildings, we have one giant building. Typically, it's built out of matchsticks held together with gusset plates. At a minimum, you're going to need to know where the standpipe connections and FDC are, as well as sprinkler control valves, firewalls and doors, the fire alarm panel, Knox box, Knox key switches, and utility cutoffs in order to respond effectively to emergency incidents at a modern apartment complex. Another category of incident that may require pre-planning is rescue. This includes planning for technical rescue, water rescue, or confined space rescue. For instance, recently when a new ride was installed at the State Fair, the USAR team took the initiative to make a site visit and pre-plan how they would respond to effect rescue if the ride failed, leaving passengers stranded out of reach of an aerial ladder. A little forethought before an emergency goes a long ways towards mitigating it when it actually happens. Yet another type of pre-incident planning involves documenting lessons learned from previous incidents. In this case, a concrete patio deck was supported by lightweight truss construction, which quickly gave way when under attack by fire, dropping a firefighter to the room below. We were extremely lucky that the firefighter suffered only minor injuries, but I can imagine another fire happening at this location some years in the future and not one soul answering the call who has any knowledge about the close call we had here. Who bears responsibility if a firefighter is killed here in the future because we didn't pass the lesson we learned on to our brothers? I would say his blood is on our hands if we don't take the time to document the lesson learned and put it in the system so it can benefit future responders. We've done some pre-incident planning in the past, but all too often the information existed only inside people's heads. I had a salty old driver at Aids who knew the district forwards and backwards. We'd be driving back from runs and he would point out hazards to us. You see that house over there? The only thing holding that thing up is force of habit. If we have anything there, we don't need to be going inside. We need to mount a defensive attack. You see that building right there? That used to be a YMCA and it's got an empty swimming pool in it. If that building's full of smoke, don't go charging off in there or you'll find yourself falling in a hole. Having that kind of knowledge locked up inside one man's head was bad enough back when we mostly answered in our own district and when crews worked together at a station for a long time. But today, we're subject to answering anywhere in the city, and even within our district, we often only have one guy that's worked at the station long enough to know the district. And you know what? That salty old driver who's worked at your station for 20 years is probably going to be off on a holiday when the big one comes in. Thus the need for a good pre-incident planning system. Fortunately, we have a good system for documenting hazards at buildings, and once we've put information in the system, we can quickly retrieve it when needed at an emergency incident. We'll describe how that works in upcoming videos.